a story about the fragility of our natural environment and how through scientific innovation we can restore some of Tasmania's most endangered ecosystems. Tasmania used to be home to some of the largest giant kelp forests in the world. But over the last 100 years, 95% of these critical ecosystems have disappeared. Fortescue Bay, on Tasmania's Tasman Peninsula, used to be home to some of the largest giant kelp forests in the world. But now, they've all since disappeared. All that remains in the bay are a few single plants of giant kelp. What we are witnessing is an ecological disaster. To really understand this decline, we need to look at the data. When we overlay aerial surveys from 1986, 1989 and 1999, we can see just how much giant kelp the bay used to have. Now in contrast, an aerial survey from 2019 found no giant kelp in the bay, desolate of the species. What's happening at Fortescue isn't exactly rare. Tasmania has experienced a 95% decline in giant kelp, pretty much across all areas. But just why has Tasmania lost 95% of its giant kelp? To find out, I spoke to Dr. Kane Layton.
The reason we've lost a lot of our giant kelp is with the East Australian current, which is bringing its warm, nutrient-poor water to Tasmania. But it's not only bringing that water mass, it's also bringing other creatures and other larvae with it. One of them is the long-spined urchin, or Centra stephanus rogersii. And this urchin, which looks like a big kind of spiky basketball, it just devours all the seaweed, not just the kelp, basically everything. And it turns these really lush, beautiful kelp forests into almost like the surface of the moon, or like an underwater desert. And so in some areas, we've also seen our giant kelp forest get transformed into what's called an urchin barren, which is this underwater desert where there's literally not a scrap of seaweed. It's as bare as the surface of this table right here. So that's pretty alarming. But the giant kelp were really on the way out before the urchin became a really big problem in Tasmania. So in Tasmania, we've lost about 95% of our giant kelp. And we've spoken to people at boat ramps and beaches and jetties across the state, and they explained to us, this bay used to have giant kelp forest that was so thick you couldn't actually swim through it. You couldn't drive a boat through it because you just get wrapped up in the giant kelp. They used to have to cut a channel through it actually. And now many of those bays, most of those bays, don't have a single giant kelp left. That forest canopy, that floating canopy on the surface of the water, is just gone.
But why are Tasmania's giant kelp forests just so important? Giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera, serves as the foundation of some of Tasmania's most critical underwater ecosystems. When giant kelp is lost, the species that live in and around it are destroyed as well, so the ecosystem is desolated. Giant kelp can grow as tall as 50 metres and at a rate of 60 centimetres per day, making it the world's tallest kelp. The species was prominent around Tasmania's rocky reef, but now 95% of it has died, desolating kilometres of underwater habitat.
So what we're doing with our restoration efforts is a way to kind of maximise their success, is we're looking for individual giant kelp that are just naturally more tolerant of warm water. So we're going out to that remaining 5% of patches of giant kelp in Tasmania, and we sample from them and we bring them back to the lab here and we test them in the lab. And from that remaining 5%, we find some genotypes or strains or families or whatever you want to call them that are just naturally more tolerant of warm water. And they're the ones that we then can cultivate in really large quantities and outplant them back into the ocean. And they're kind of the foundation of our restoration efforts, because that little bit of extra warm tolerance hopefully gives them a fighting chance in our oceans that are warming very rapidly. The way that restoration takes place, a lot of people have images of us planting 10-metre tall giant kelp, and that's actually not the way we do it. We plant them when they're really, really small, only about 1 millimetre or 2 in size. And the way we do that is we seed them onto different materials or different substrates here in the lab. So these are our giant kelp cultures. This is kind of the secret to our success. So by keeping these baby giant kelp here under red light, we basically put them in suspended animation. And that means that they persist, they still reproduce vegetatively or clonally, but they don't mature to that next life stage, which means we don't have 20, 30 metre tall giant kelp growing out of this room. Each of the flasks here are baby kelp from a single individual. So this means we have a lot of power and a lot of delicacy and detail, and that we can go and crossbreed and select for individual giant kelp that might be more tolerant of warm water. And so it's pretty spectacular that these little kind of microscopic dots, these have the potential to grow into a 30 or 40 metre tall adult giant kelp. So the way we test for the temperature tolerance for these giant kelp is it's very simple. We just grow them in a range of different temperatures, from quite cool and comfortable up to really warm and stressful. And obviously those individual flasks, or the kelp from those individual flasks that survive those warm temperatures, they're the individuals that are more tolerant of warm water, and they're the individuals that we want for our restoration trials. So we'll put our material, it might be string, it might be ceramic plates, whatever, into a solution of kelp, of the microscopic life stage. They'll settle and start growing on that material, that substrate, and then we move that to the field and we'll bolt it into the rock, or we'll attach it to the rock in some way on the rocky reef. And from that, which has thousands and thousands of little baby kelp on it, from that they'll start to grow, and that's how we can restore some of our reefs with giant kelp.
Through advances in scientific innovation, we are bringing back Tasmania's giant kelp forest from the brink of extinction. By saving the species, we are restoring an ecosystem, and in the process, paving the way forward for future marine restoration projects.